Okay, so we might make a start to it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, as always, for coming along to the session today. Both everybody joining us over Zoom, but also everybody watching on YouTube as well. And you're very welcome to this session, which is going to look at learning experience design. So this is going to be something of a whistle-stop tour. You'll have to forgive me in advance if I talk very fast or if I get incomprehensible at any stage. I suppose the purpose of the session today, and this is kind of based on feedback which we've gotten through the survey, which we put out to staff recently, but also kind of feedback which has been given to us informally over the last period as well. And the intention is to try and provide some kind of useful tools around learning experience design. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about what learning experience design is. We're going to look at some methodologies, one in particular called the LX Canvas for learning experience design. I'd like to take a look at a design and development approach called the successive approximation model, which is designed to help you, I suppose, equip you or help you structure a particular approach to developing useful kind of learning resources which can be used with students. And then I'm going to cover at the end of the session, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the process of maybe selecting the right digital tool for the right teaching task, and then finish off with maybe just kind of a bit of an activity or homework, I guess, around how one can apply the LXD methodology and the design and development approach to help supposed to help staff moving forward. So it's kind of a broad ranging session, but the intention is really to give you a series of tools and kind of guidelines on how to use those tools so that you might have access and might be equipped with kind of something which will be of genuine use to you moving forward. So I would maybe just preface this session by saying this session kind of follows on from two previous training sessions in particular, one on active learning and another one given by my colleagues Lauren and Shane around H5P. So we would say kind of active learning approaches and maybe the use or the potential presented by H5P, which is available inside in the Canvas VLE. They very much kind of are tied into kind of what I'm looking to talk about today in terms of learning experience design, because there's a lot of, I guess, crossover with active learning approaches. And the use of H5P can be particularly useful in developing interactive learning objects. So the active learning training session, the H5P learning session, you don't have to have seen those, hopefully, to get something out of the session today. But if you do get a chance, or if anything that I'm going to talk about here is of interest to you, I would say that maybe if you get a chance to look at those training sessions, you might get more out of the session today, or might spark some additional elements. So if we were to look at the whole area of learning experience design and some key elements related to it, the first three are obvious enough. Learning experience and design is very much in the title. And then beyond that, learning experience design, I guess, is very human-centered and is very goal-orientated. So the learning in learning experience design really is kind of a focus on the learner and the processes that the learners go through. So the intention of the whole learning element in learning experience design is really to try and kind of gather quite a holistic picture of learning and the different approaches which learning can take. And you can see kind of in that graphic on the right-hand side there, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but, learning kind of is not just kind of throwing up PowerPoints to students. There's a whole range of different kind of areas, sub areas, skills and knowledge, which is involved in good learning. And that can include philosophy, psychology, experiential learning, the whole pedagogical kind of approach to teaching, educational expertise, instructional design, so on and so forth. I suppose one key feature in terms of learning experience design is that notion of experience, that when we talk about learning experience design, what we're really talking about is creating positive, engaging, effective experiences for students or for whatever type of learner. So when talking about learning experience design, the bit in the middle, experience, refers to anything which takes an amount of time to learn and leaves an impression. So it's important maybe to kind of consider when we talk about learning experience design, it's important to consider that notion of an experience as central to the entire thing. And one kind of interesting point which learning experience does throw up is that experiences are not necessarily uniformly good or pleasant. It's not the case that every experience should be rainbows and gumdrops and sunshine. Some experiences, and kind of there's a very interesting field of study in this around transformational learning experiences, can be very painful, can cause a great deal of stress and kind of difficulty. But the suggestion is that through that stress, through that difficulty, through that effort, there is a benefit, and one does kind of extend oneself and kind of extend kind of, for instance, cognitive processing, um, awareness of kind of task, perspective on kind of particular approaches. So um, I guess one key takeaway from this is that kind of when we talk about learning experience design, what we're really talking about is creating experiences. And one other consideration when we talk about an experience is it's not just when the student kind of walks into and the class and kind of our responsibility ends when they walk back out of the class. The notion of an experience is that kind of there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it can be as kind of big or as small as we want it to be. So when we talk about an experience, it's important maybe to set out our own parameters on what that experience is. If I want to give my students a positive learning experience over while they take my module over the course of a semester, for instance, then that experience is going to begin before they come into the first live session, and it's going to continue after they exit the last live session. So the notion of an experience is just a slightly different, maybe slightly broader, more all-encompassing, more holistic way of looking at kind of students' engagement with you as a teacher. When we talk about design, then there's any number of different kind of interpretations of the whole area of design. Learning experience design is this notion that one works like a designer. Now, they kind of use the term designer. I'm not sure that kind of I would necessarily agree with their interpretation. Generally, kind of it involves kind of processes that would be familiar to all of us. So for example, there would be elements of research, there would be elements of experimentation, of ideation, of testing, but there is this notion that there is maybe a mix of different kind of skill sets or kind of approaches or viewpoints when we do talk about design. And again, that's maybe reflected a bit in the graphic on the right, in terms of we could talk about interaction design, we could talk about user experience design, we could talk about industrial design, graphic design. So the area of design is not just nice looking slides, it goes well beyond that into kind of the processes that a designer would use. And kind of when you kind of get down into it, a lot of the processes that an interaction designer would use, or a UX designer would use, or a game designer or an industrial designer would use, they're all similar. They all do have kind of common characteristics. So the notion of design is not so much visual design, it's kind of working like a designer in terms of planning out what is to be done, sequencing things, learning about your target audience, experimenting, testing, so on and so forth. Human-centered means viewing learning as a human process, and I guess ideally a social one too. So this kind of goes back to what maybe was mentioned a bit in terms of an experience and the need to put your learner at the center of a design process. So the whole thing is very kind of human-centered. It's focused on the learner as an individual. And that might necessitate sometimes a bit of a move away from very traditional ways of teaching and learning. That involves kind of, I suppose, and it's something which was referenced in the previous slide when we talked about design, to a certain degree, that kind of requires understanding your learner, what motivates them, what drives them, what appeals to them. Not necessarily that we have to cater to what they like or what will appeal to them most, but I think having an awareness of them, of their context, of their situation, potentially of their limitations, or what can be reasonably expected or not expected from them. And that notion of being human centered really means that kind of identifying the learner as a human being and being aware of, what they as a human being require or kind of are expecting or are able to do. So developing an awareness of the learner and kind of their unique kind of circumstances and viewpoints. And then key element as well in learning experience design is that it is goal orientated. So it's kind of human centered, but there is a focus on reaching a particular goal, and choosing the right goals is essential to the process. And I suppose for us in kind of higher education, certainly the goal is nearly always, I think, within MTU Cork going to be related to the learning outcomes for this particular module. So that is a very clear set of goals, which I think the entire process is kind of driven by and aims for. But if one was to kind of expand that remit a bit, maybe there are additional kind of goals which you want for your learners beyond just reaching the learning outcomes. Maybe it's preparing them for the workplace. Maybe it's kind of your learning or kind of your teaching process, making them more positive in a societal or in a kind of within their own confidence in themselves. So the whole notion of goal orientated is kind of taken care of for us by virtue of kind of teaching in MTU Cork. But there is going to be additional, or there may be, depending on how much you're willing to suffer yourself around what else you want to kind of give your learners as part of the learning process. So the entire kind of learning experience design process then is kind of represented a small bit like this. And between those different quadrants, we can see that there are these different kind of areas which we referred to earlier. So I suppose that's just a very kind of broad overview of the whole learning experience design thought process or kind of concept. If we were to look at particular methodologies and approaches related to learning experience design, well, there are quite a few of them. Apologies, my slides aren't loading for some reason there. So when we talk about different kind of learning experience design methodologies, there's any number of these available. So some relatively kind of famous ones, or some relatively famous ones include that one there by Rosenheck and all. And that is very much kind of a learning experience design process, which is focused on kind of, as they would put it, the workplace. So there is this notion of, for example, learning science and also knowledge harvesting from employees and so on and so forth. There are additional kind of processes, such as the one kind of represented here by iDesign. And there's this learning experience development process model. But where a lot of these different methodologies maybe kind of come from is the whole area of design thinking. And design thinking, as identified by Tim Brown there, is basically an approach to problem solving in which inspiration, ideation, and implementation occur not in sequence, but as a system of overlapping spaces. So I suppose maybe just some observations around design thinking to be aware of is that there's no one specific approach to design thinking. It's not that there's a single kind of methodology or kind of way of performing design thinking. It's more of a different kind of way of thinking as opposed to a specific academic discipline. And as identified by Richard Buchanan there, if you ask 10 people what service design is, you'd come up with 11 different answers. For anyone interested, there is a fantastic certificate in designing innovative services, which is an online course available in MTU Cork, which is offered by the Department of Accounting and Information Systems, and the course coordinator is Fred Creedon. I'm a graduate of that course myself, and I really can't recommend it highly enough. It's extremely useful as a way of kind of getting used to and kind of gathering information on design teaching, which I found particularly useful, and something which is excuse me, my slides are kind of acting up on me, but I just found kind of the cert in designing innovative services something which I could plug into pretty much anything and everything that I do within my kind of job at MTU Cork, and that includes lecturing. So I really can't recommend that kind of strongly enough. One kind of learning experience design methodology or tool which might be quite useful, however, is called the LX Canvas. And the notion of the LX Canvas is it's basically just kind of a set of guidelines or a structure to help you to plan out, design, and then develop effective learning experience for students. And the way that it does this It's represented in this kind of visual fashion here, but essentially you could just think of this about just a Word document that you put together yourself, where you're just putting down information that will help guide you into offering learners the best possible experience. So it has a nice visual design here, but I mean, you could really just think of it as a Word document and it will work equally effectively. So the notion with the LX canvas is really that there are these different sections to it. And the idea is very simply that if we add in information to these different sections in a particular sequence, it will help inform the decisions we make, which will help us provide the best possible learning experience to our learners. Now, this is something which I think a huge amount of staff in MTU Cork have done or do very regularly. But it may be at more of a subconscious level. There may be an element of autopilot to it, because if you have been teaching for quite a while, then you probably are very able to, fill in this information without necessarily having to put a huge amount of thought into it. So I found one of the benefits of the learning experience canvas is really just that it kind of, I suppose, structured the process for me and helped me put down on paper the different kind of considerations, sequences, and approaches that I could use to give students the best possible learning experience. So for me, and I think for certainly the vast majority of teaching staff in NTU Cork, it's not that this is going to be anything particularly new, but it maybe might be a useful guide just in helping you to identify maybe areas for improvements or slightly different activities which could be offered to learners. And a lot of the information here is kind of things that you really won't have to rack your brains about too much. I think it's information that will come to most of us quite quickly and easily, simply by virtue of the fact that it's information we've already had to, for the most part, figure out just to kind of be able to deliver a module effectively. But in looking at the LX Canvas, a couple of different kind of areas which would require information. The first is maybe the learning outcomes, and obviously those can be the module learning outcomes. Following on from that then are learning objectives. Now, I know obviously in third level there's we would be aware of the difference between learning outcomes and learning objectives. In this particular instance, learning objectives really refers to specific goals needed to achieve the learning outcome. And you can identify those here, for instance, as behavior, learner behaviors that you want to inculcate, learner insights you want to present, and the skills and knowledge that the learner should develop. So a bit different to the kind of learning outcomes, lest there be any confusion about that. People then would refer to all people who take part. And I suppose one thing to bear in mind is maybe that it is not just us and the learners that are the people involved. You can consider, I suppose it depends on how broad you want to make your remit. But for example, very little of this will go on without the fantastic services provided by IT services, without the support students get from their student union, without the career counseling which might be available to them. So people, and again, I think this kind of refers back to the notion of creating an experience that maybe goes beyond the class, when the class begins and when the class ends. But the people could be all the people who take part. And I suppose by putting down that long list of people involved, that can maybe help kind of spark new ideas, new kind of benefits for students, new kind of approaches, new ways of doing things. Characteristics then might refer to what motivates or improves learners. So if you do have kind of an awareness of your learners, then the characteristics can help you to maybe, again, just by putting it down on paper, maybe just to kind of think about and to kind of, what drives learners, what motivates them, what encourages them, what deflates them. And kind of by, again, just by having that information on paper, it can spark additional thoughts, additional kind of awareness, or kind of new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at teaching and learning activities. When we talk about the environment, we kind of identify and environments which influence how interaction will happen. And again, this is kind of maybe something more for your own decision making in terms of how big or how small you may wish to make this. you might want to go with this information. But you could think about the physical environment, which unfortunately is not massively available to a lot of us at the moment, the virtual environments where learning can happen. And that doesn't have to just be on Canvas. That could be through Zoom, that could be through email, that can be through blogs, any number of social media, potentially any number of different areas. And you can think about the social environments that you might share with students, or that students might share with each other, and the cultural kind of environments. Location then is really where the experiences will take place. So if interaction is what happens in the environment, then location is where the experience, the learning will actually happen. And again, you can think about this in terms of not just kind of one space. So for example, I was going to say a year ago, but it's further back than that even, when we were all still kind of physically on campus, that will be within the classroom, but it might also be on Canvas. It might be through Zoom. It might be over email. It might be all these additional locations where these learning experiences will happen. Constraints very broadly just refers to the limitations that you and your learners might be facing. And resources kind of refers to everything available at your disposal. So maybe it's important as well to consider resources, not just in terms of what MTU Cork provides, but also what you yourself have, what the learners themselves have. And the notion is, by filling out these kind of 8 different kind of areas, the learning outcomes, objectives, people, characteristics, environments, locations, constraints, and resources, that then can help inform the strategy. And the suggestion in terms of developing the strategy for the learning experience canvas is, as is identified there, to think like a programmer. So in programming, there is this notion of if then. And what that basically means is to kind of think about things in a very kind of logical, sequential way. So if we can't meet in a physical classroom, then we'll have to meet in a virtual classroom. If Zoom isn't available to me, or if Zoom is, or if Zoom is not going to be available, then I will have to maybe put out a recording at a later date. So that's real kind of top of the head stuff. But there is that suggestion that kind of when you're figuring out your strategy based on the information you've put together from these 8 different elements, then kind of thinking about it in that logical, sequential way can maybe help you to kind of identify, find solutions to certain items which might be kind of arising here. So for example, based on your restraints, you can maybe look at those very much with an if-then kind of approach. If this is a constraint, then what can I do to overcome it? Following on from the strategies, then the notion with the strategy is that then, can inform activities and processes. So activities is essentially the kind of, I guess I don't really need to explain those. They're what you do, what the learners do in order to reach the learning outcomes or the learning objectives. Processes within the canvas then refer to the learning experience as it happens over time. And the important thing to think about those is, as is identified there, the devil is in the details when it comes to that. So when will it take place? How long will it take place? Where will it take place? In what order will these different kind of processes happen? So that's a real kind of rush job through the learning experience canvas. But I would say it can be quite a useful process. And again, maybe don't get too hung up on how this is kind of presented here. You could think about this as a Word document with a header that says learning outcomes, another header that says learning objectives with subheaders for behavior, insight. And the idea with the learning experience canvas really is just kind of, it's almost like a brainstorming device. It's just a way of putting down all the information which can help inform the learning experience in one place so that you can maybe make sense of it, sift through it. And again, there is that notion, hopefully it's some way kind of visible even in this kind of graphic, that kind of your learning outcomes help inform your learning objectives, your people help inform the characteristics, and all of that helps to inform the strategy, which informs the activities, which informs the processes. So if anyone is interested more in kind of getting a copy of the learning experience canvas, we can certainly send out a PDF to you around this. Some other considerations then, just I suppose in conjunction with the learning experience canvas, is the successive approximation model. So I'm not going to spend too long on this, but the idea with the successive approximation model is basically it's an approach towards designing and developing learning experiences. I guess in particular, asynchronous learning experiences, such as what one might produce with H5P. And the idea with the SAM model is that it is this kind of very kind of broad, very kind of lean kind of approach in terms of development. But I would say you maybe don't have to worry too much about this kind of approach to the SAM model. There is a more basic version, which is presented like this. And the idea with the SAM approach is really just that one might go through a number of kind of iterative kind of phases of evaluation, design, and development. So hopefully that graphic even kind of visually represents that somewhat. This notion that, okay, I'm going to start the process and I'm going to start off with an evaluation. Once I have that kind of analysis done, I can begin designing. Once I'm finished my design, I can begin developing. But then it doesn't just kind of end. The sequence kind of repeats. I'm going to begin the kind of second loop with evaluating what I've done, seeing how effective that is, and then beginning another process of design and development before kind of finishing. So if we were to look at that as kind of an initial sequence, one might evaluate by a quick analysis of the situation and goals. Who are the learners? What needs to change? What do they know now? What can I do for them? And again, the learning experience canvas can inform a huge amount of this. Following on from that, the first design phase might involve a very quick design inside, not even inside an H5P, but maybe even on pen and paper, just to try and kind of put some kind of shape or some kind of form on what it is you're going to develop. So you might think about kind of listing and organizing goals, listing learning outcomes, listing ways learners can be appraised, and you might sketch out a few kind of sample ideas. So the point of this is really to kind of work in pen and paper format, but before moving on to any kind of digital development. And then development would really just kind of, the first iteration of development would focus on just producing very rough prototypes, working, for lack of a better term, very kind of quick and very kind of dirty, resisting the urge, as is identified there, to do something fancy or to try and make something very, very usable. The idea with the whole kind of SAM approach really is that you don't do this loop just the one time. You do it a number of times. So if you're to think about even doing it 3 times, the point of the first iteration, that first phase of evaluation, design, and development, is really just to try and get something down, put some kind of rough shape on something. And in the second iteration, you can improve upon what you've done. And in the third iteration, you can improve upon what you've done in the second iteration. So working in that kind of loop or that kind of series of iterations, it's important not to try and get everything right the first time around, or to get too hung up on making the first go the kind of final product. The idea is that you try and limit the amount of time and energy you put into it, because you're aware that there's kind of you're going to do a second iteration or a third iteration or a fourth or a fifth or a sixth iteration. So the idea with this approach is really that kind of you work very kind of quick and kind of rough, and that kind of the repeated iteration, the repeated loops is how things get polished, and that's what makes them more effective. So finally, what I wanted to cover is maybe just a couple of words on selecting the right digital tools for the right teaching activity. Now, a key warning here is that I'm certainly in no way presenting this as an exhaustive list or as an exhaustive set of tools. I have tried to maybe focus on tools which are available to you through the TEL ecosystem, through Canvas and Zoom and Screencast-O-Matic and H5P. But obviously this isn't an exhaustive list, so please don't read it as such. And just a quick note that a lot of, if you would like to know more about how to use specific tools for specific teaching and learning activities, a lot of the information here comes from a national forum project that the Department of TEL actually ran called Tell You. And the idea with this was, it really is just putting together a collection of resources for higher education staff and secondary education and primary education staff, with a view to kind of providing clear guidelines around what types of technologies and what types of digital tools are useful for specific teaching and learning activities. So the website for that is still available at telu.me. So if you would like to learn more about kind of some of what I'm talking about in this session, that is available to you. So just in terms of a couple of different teaching tools, Canvas is a very obvious one. And when I say Canvas, I maybe mean the kind of online space that Canvas presents. So within your module, you have the access to to share files, to kind of structure content, to provide the syllabus, to kind of help kind of guide students. But I suppose it's important to think about Canvas maybe in the sense of it's a space where you can bring all these different tools together. So within your Canvas module, you can combine all the different tools available to you, all the different files available to you, not only for design and development, but also for communication, for peer feedback, for social elements. So Canvas is probably the best kind of catch-all space as kind of a broad kind of teaching tool or kind of an environment to offer kind of teaching and learning. Pages within Canvas, then I always try to think about pages in Canvas similar to I suppose the physical equivalent, which is me printing out a number of different pages that provides, useful learning material to students, or provides a brief, or provides kind of learning content to them, and distributing those in class. So Canvas pages in a similar way can be used to offer kind of like printed pages, but which can also have text, images, links, but can also allow for additional media to be embedded in them. So within a page, you can have links to module content, you can embed a YouTube video, you can also allow students to create their own pages or to collaborate on pages themselves, which can be useful as a way of collaborative development, but also for students to use those pages potentially as a journal, as a file sharing tool, as a way of sharing resources with each other, so on and so forth. So pages in Canvas are actually, I would say, kind of an underrated but very useful tool for, I suppose, again, to go back to the face-to-face kind of equivalent. I print out a page, which is very useful information for students, be it related to the learning or to their assignments or whatever, and I hand that out to students in class. So that is essentially, for me, what pages are kind of useful for. Video as a kind of as a digital teaching tool is fantastic for performance or demonstration. So kind of sounds obvious saying it, but it is funny how often we kind of forget about the use of video to do specifically that. So anything that requires live demonstration of a task, use of a piece of equipment, a particular performance, so on and so forth, video genuinely is fantastic for that. And I suppose, the ubiquitousness of YouTube as kind of a learning tool, if my boiler breaks down, the first thing that I'm going to do is go on YouTube to try and find a video that shows me how to fix it, kind of speaks to that fact as well. But video can also be used in a teaching context as a way of communicating, welcoming, providing feedback, which goes beyond just kind of basic text. Generally, when we talk about the use of video for teaching, when you're talking about very professional, high-class video, that can be very expensive and time-consuming to develop. But for our purposes, we can develop our own video very quickly and very easily in Canvas. So within Canvas, you can record video, for instance, directly through your webcam into a page, or into an assignment, or into the syllabus, or in SpeedGrader to give feedback to students. So there's a number of different kind of spaces in Canvas where you can record video directly and perfectly well if you have a webcam. And if you have a microphone, a half decent microphone, it doesn't have to be professional quality. And even if your computer doesn't have those, the Teacher app, which you can download onto your smartphone, is a fantastic tool, which gives you access to the camera and the microphone features which you have in your smartphone, which are very often much easier to use or far superior to what you might have on your computer. So the ability to use video to present to students, to demonstrate to students, to welcome students, to give feedback to students, can be leveraged very quickly and easily and effectively in Canvas, either through the browser or on your smartphone. And the same is very much true of of audio. So the use of audio is a great way to support on-the-go or outside the class learning, and can be, I suppose, students can access it by virtue of the fact that we have smartphones, headphones, internet wherever we go. Students kind of can access audio information anytime, anywhere. And again, we think about maybe how popular podcasting is, how popular Spotify is. The ability of a student to simply listen to something on their smartphone through a set of headphones, wherever they are, whatever they're doing, makes audio a very kind of flexible and effective teaching tool. So it can be very effective as micro learning. can be used as a useful way of communicating, welcoming, providing feedback. So the same way that I spoke about the use of video, for instance, to welcome students to a course by putting it into the syllabus page, or as a means of giving students feedback through SpeedGrader, the exact same is true of audio. So within Canvas or within the teacher app on your smartphone, it's possible to record audio directly into the Canvas system. And then instead of a student necessarily having to read through text which is given to them, or you having to type out all of that text, you can simply provide audio directly to a student as a way of giving them feedback on an assessment, of welcoming them to something, or else you could potentially consider developing kind of mini podcasts. So micro learning is a very interesting and kind of very effective approach for using audio for teaching. If you were to think about the provision of additional kind of out of class learning content to students, the use of audio can be very effective for this. And again, even the notion of a podcast or the structure of a podcast is something pretty much all of us are familiar with at this stage. So presenting it to students in that fashion can actually be highly effective. The use of Screencast-O-Matic is available to all all MTU Cork staff. And you can access Screencast-O-Matic by going to our help center, which is also linked to from tel.cit.ie, and access the kind of installation instructions for Screencast-O-Matic. And what screencasts are highly effective for is on-screen demonstration. So if I have a piece of software, or I have a website, or I have a repository, or I have even a paper or an article or a publication that I want to that I want students to see while I speak over it, screencasting is fantastic for that. So if I want to show students how to do something on screen, perhaps what we would have done quite recently is how to use Zoom, how to use Canvas, so on and so forth. The ability to be able to show a student what you are doing on screen while you're speaking over that process can be highly effective, as I mentioned, for all of those different areas. But screencasting can also be very useful for recordings of presentations. So in much the same way that I am doing now, I am showing a series of slides and you're listening to me talk over it. That can be done very quickly and very effectively with screencasting. And that kind of process is a very useful way of being able to take an existing kind of teaching resource, which you already have, such as a PowerPoint, and being able to make that into a more engaging, more effective, more useful teaching tool just through the process of presenting it, recording your screen through Screencast-O-Matic, and speaking over the slides as you go through them. And as I mentioned, Screencast-O-Matic licenses are available for all MTU staff. H5P was something which I mentioned at the beginning of the session, and H5P allows a means of creating interactive digital learning objects. One of the big benefits of H5P, and I really would strongly encourage you to go watch the training session, which is given by Shane and Lauren, is that it allows you to take existing resources and essentially to kind of just make those a little bit more interactive, a bit more engaging, and a bit more effective. So if there's a video that you use in your teaching already, H5P would allow you to add in some form of assessment or some form of knowledge check at the end of that video. If you have a PowerPoint, you can make that into a more interactive kind of element through H5P just by opening up H5P in Canvas, importing in the PowerPoint or series of slides, and being able to add material on top of those, being able to make it engaging and interactive. And very often when we talk about simulations, the impression people get are, well, I got to go and get a VR helmet, and I got to get, I don't know, I need to hop into the future, and I need to get some kind of 3D holograph VR style kind of technology. But genuinely, simulation is is really just kind of an attempt to give someone an interactive experience where you're putting learners in someone's shoes. Which is very beneficial, as mentioned there, for assessment, for experiential learning, so on and so forth. And it's very possible to create a very effective kind of online interactive simulation in H5P. I would argue that the process of putting together a simulation for learning, for the most part, it really just comes down to trying to situate the learner in a particular context, as is mentioned there, in someone else's shoes. And that can be done very basically through a little bit of storytelling, a little bit of narrative, a little bit of exposition, and H5P lends itself very well to that process. So, for instance, you are faced with a member of TEL droning on a Tuesday afternoon when you've got loads to do. You know, what activity will you follow? What will you put to use? So a simulation can be hugely effective, but it doesn't need to be a big VR slash augmented reality slash 3D kind of experience. It can just be the process. It can be anything which kind of puts a learner in, as I mentioned there, somebody else's shoes or in a particular situation or context. I've mentioned the Canvas teacher and the Canvas students app, which can be downloaded to a smartphone. So I think I've really kind of covered most of what I had intended to say about them. And a session which we gave recently on OERs, or Open Educational Resources, made reference to Canvas Commons. So that is essentially the Commons item in the Canvas menu on the left-hand side when you log in. And essentially what that presents is a shared space for MTU Cork staff to share resources. So you can share files, you can share courses, you can share whatever you want with the rest of the university. And you can share with just MTU Cork staff, or you can share with all Canvas users. And there's also a wide range of existing resources which are developed by other Canvas users, which can be freely used by MTU Cork staff. So Canvas Commons is essentially just one big open kind of space where material, files, courses can be shared and where you can kind of draw from. Learning analytics, we did another session on this recently, but is an area which is developing all the time. In Canvas, the main kind of tool for learning analytics in each module is under new analytics. And you can maybe think about learning analytics in terms of, students' grades, their participation, discussion contributions, but also I would say as well, your informal observation. So your impression of students is every bit as valuable and very often more valuable than kind of a lot of the data which is presented. It's just that through a combination of all this available data that kind of you're able to put together actionable plans and kind of useful interventions for our students. And again, the recording for that kind of for that learning analytics session, there were 2 of them actually, is available on our YouTube channel. And as part of that, there's also a number of Zoom reports which provide useful learning analytics. And then discussion and communication tools, I don't need to spend too much time on. I think most people are very aware of those, but those are key for helping ensure student engagement, collaboration, communication, and the development of a community. And again, there's a range of different kind of communication tools available inside in Canvas. There's discussion forums, there's chat areas, there's the Canvas inbox, there's an announcements feature which is available to you in a Canvas module. So I would say, as part of the learning, if you do want to use the LX Canvas, maybe try and remember to include some element of communication or community or collaboration in the process. So, like I said at the beginning, a real kind of whistle-stop tour. Apologies for that, but I did want to try and cover, I suppose, those different areas because I think used in conjunction, they can be quite effective. So if you do want to take away a bit of homework in terms of what this session covered, you could, for instance, focus on developing an LX Canvas for your students. For the most part, I think for most modules, it will be the same year to year. So if you do kind of have an initial go at developing it, you could potentially make it available to students and get their feedback on it, or it could be shared with kind of your colleagues. And based on your development of the LX Canvas, you can then maybe select kind of activities tools that would be that are useful, I guess, to help support the findings of your learning experience Canvas. And again, I would say, like I mentioned earlier, the point here is that this isn't necessarily a huge amount of new information. It's not necessarily kind of throwing everything that you are doing or that you have done out the window. For the most part, I think for anyone listening to this, it's really just going to be maybe a way of looking at potentially additional improvements or potentially additional tools which could be used, or other elements which might maybe just make your teaching and learning processes slightly more effective or slightly more engaging. So again, the point of the LX Canvas isn't to kind of create something brand new. It's just maybe to look at what is there, the information that you do have available to you, and based on that, look at maybe making some additional kind of improvements or innovations in how you teach. And then the final step, once you've developed your LX Canvas, is that you could use something like H5P to develop some additional online interactive resources. And the SAM approach can be very useful in helping you to kind of structure that process of development in an iterative, user-involved approach. And I would say if you were to take that, if you were to kind of complete this homework, getting feedback from other people is key. But I would say kind of feedback can be gotten kind of year to year. It doesn't just necessarily end at the end of semester. The idea with this kind of approach is that it is hopefully giving you tools which are informed by, to a certain degree, an evidence-based approach to the LX Canvas, which you can use well into the future. So the point of this isn't, it's not that this has to be done straight away for use in this semester. If you are able to develop this, if you are able to improve this, if you are able to go through this process, the idea is that you will have a kind of your own repository of interactive resources, of additional online tools that will help you with delivery kind of into the future, into the next kind of number of years, even after we go back to physical based classrooms